Hey guys, welcome back to the channel. My name is Adrian and today we are going to be doing an end of the year or start of the year video. We are looking at the best fantasy and sci-fi reads in 2021. So the top 10 books that I read last year from the fantasy or sci-fi genres, which are the vast majority of what I read, and I am whittling it down with a couple of rules here. So these are books that were new to me, so no rereads. And I think there was a reread this year, does not count in this list. As well as that, there is only going to be one book per author, which has made it surprisingly difficult where there have been multiple series or multiple books in a series that I love from the same author that I have read this year. So it's been very difficult. It's been like choosing my favorite children or my favorite child. It is very difficult. You shouldn't have to do it. It's really mean, but it should make an interesting video. So in at number 10, my 10th favorite book I have read this year, it is by Jen Williams. This is from the Winnowing Flame trilogy, and it is book 3 of the Winnowing Flame trilogy, The Poison Song. Now, this trilogy is really, really interesting. If you haven't seen my Should I Read video for this, you should go check it out. But this is a fantasy world with some interesting sci-fi elements. It is a strange one. It feels like there's a lot of world building elements that have just been thrown together, but it works really, really, really well. I love the way Jen Williams has developed this series. I think the first book was very, very good and strong. The second book, The Bitter Twins, dropped off a little bit for me, but book 3, The Poison Song, was brilliant with an epic ending, with a real gut punch. I am not sure that I will forgive Jen Williams for the decisions she made at the end of the series, maybe ever. I felt very invested and I really was on board for a particular thing, and she gave me something else, and that worked. Like I like that happened. It really hurt me a little bit, but in a really good way. So Jen Williams writing very well, got me very emotionally invested in her characters, and then made a decision that I would have decided the other way of doing it, but she actually did it really well, and I'm a big fan. I am definitely looking forward to reading more Jen Williams in 2022, but The Poison Song, book 3 of the Winning Flame trilogy, comes in at number 10. In at number 9 is a big surprise for me. This is a book that I had no intention of reading this year. I have never heard of it before, but I read it and I absolutely adored it. This is a standalone book called The Seasons of Albedon. It is by Christopher Warman and Elan Marche. It is self-published and it is beautiful. It is a book of 4 different stories, short stories, novellas, in that range, probably short stories, following 4 different characters that are all set chronologically after each other in a world that we are given. It is set in the forest and it's a wonderful setting. It is described really well. It really draws you into being there. I like the simplicity and effectiveness of the magic, and there are just some really heart-rending stories in this book. Particularly for me, once we get to the second and third story, we see massive strength built up. We get characters that are side characters in earlier stories coming back as main characters in later stories, and it's just done incredibly well. It's only just over 200 pages. It's a very short read, but very, very enjoyable, and it had a very strong emotional impact on me, considering how few pages, how few words were used. I think done very, very well. I am definitely looking forward to more from Christopher Warman and Elan Marche. I hope they do release more, because I really thought this was done excellently, and it was a great example of how to deliver really impactful stories without having to use hundreds of thousands of words over thousands of pages to get your point across. And I think it was very efficient and effective in conveying emotion, and I think that is a real strength for this. So if you want a shorter self-published read, Seasons of Albedon, I cannot recommend it highly enough. Next up, we're in at number 8, and this was really difficult for me to choose my favourite book from this series. I read this whole series this year, and that is The Memoirs of Lady Trent by Marie Brennan. A Natural History of Dragons, the first book in this series, I enjoyed, but it was not my favourite. But as the series progressed, it really drew me in. I think book 2, A Tropic of Serpents, is a big step up, and then Voyage of the Basilisk, book 3, and then book 4 and book 5 are all just absolutely wonderful. And I really wasn't quite sure which to choose here. I almost chose Voyage of the Basilisk because it was the book that really gripped me. I've actually put it in as The Labyrinth of Drakes, so book 4. And just this series is wonderful. It is such an interesting take on fantasy. It's not the big epic you would expect. We are following Isabella Camhurst as she is in a Victorian-esque setting, trying to become a natural historian, trying to become a scientist, studying dragons, learning more about them in this world and this culture. And a lot of this series is about dealing with different cultures and societies, societal norms, the idea of being cross-cultural. And it was very, very well done. And I think that's why I really got drawn into this series later on. I think the first book, it was cross-cultural, but to me it felt more about the science. And as we moved away from the dragon stuff, although there was still plenty of dragons involved, don't worry about that. However, as we moved away from that a little bit in focus and more to dealing with cross-cultural studies, how to be in a different culture, especially as a woman, I found that very, very interesting. And I do believe that Marie Brennan really built this series to a great crescendo. I really enjoyed where it got to, but I think Labyrinth of Drakes, for me, book 4 was the pinnacle of this series. Absolutely loved it. This is one of my favourite series of all time now, and considering how meh I was on book 1, that is astounding. So such incredibly good work done by Marie Brennan here. I would highly, highly recommend this series. Even if you are only okay with the first book, I would suggest give the second book a go, because for me, it is a big step up in quality. So in at number 7, I'm going to tell you the author, and that is Adrian Tchaikovsky. Now, this has been the year of Tchaikovsky for me. I have read 10 books by Tchaikovsky this year, I think. Let me work that out. Yep, I've read 10 books by Tchaikovsky this year. So that tells you how difficult this would have been for me to pick my favourite. Children of Time was the first one I read, and I did love it. I really enjoyed Guns of the Dawn as his fantasy offering that I have read this year. It's a flintlock fantasy and incredibly well done. But for me, my favourite book by Tchaikovsky this year is one that I've read much more recently, and that is Dogs of War. This is a shorter book. It is a sci-fi sort of dystopian future book where we are essentially following a canine cyborg called Rex, who is a good dog. He is a very interesting character to be in the head of, and I really enjoy the questions that are raised about what makes something human, what makes something sentient, about how we can use robots and machines in ways, and whether something is a machine or it has some form of humanity, whether or not that's actually human or it's just sentience. I like the way that we delve into the political ramifications of that, as well as the material military side of that earlier on. I think this book is done so well. It is explored incredibly well as well. And the second book, Bearhead, I think does a great job following up on that if you did enjoy Dogs of War. For me, this was a great sci-fi novel. It was asking a lot of the right questions, posing a lot of things for thought, and I think it explored them really, really well. And I just really grew to love the characters. There is definitely a found family aspect to this, which sounds slightly strange, that we are following 4 different bioforms who are in a military team. They have very different personalities and very different capabilities, but just done very, very well. I enjoy that Rex is the leader of that group, even if he isn't the smartest. He has the leadership potential and leadership skills, even if he has to listen to others who know more than he does and make choices based on his information from them. I think that's done very well. And just the real personality that is given to these different bioforms, I think, is done incredibly, incredibly well by Tchaikovsky. And the political wranglings that follow this, really good, top notch. A book I absolutely adore. I would highly recommend Tchaikovsky to you. I think his books are really, really, really strong. I have read 4 of The Shadows of the Apt this year, which I did enjoy, but not quite as much as his other works. Just outside of the top 5, in at number 6, is a book from The Greatcoats by Sebastian de Castell. This is Saint's Blood, book 3 of The Greatcoats. Now, again, I found this really hard to pick my favourite book here. Between book 2, Night's Shadow, book 3, Saint's Blood, and book 4, Tyrant's Throne, it's really difficult to choose. It's really, really difficult to choose. I know a lot of people actually don't enjoy Saint's Blood quite so much, and that's one of the reasons that I've picked it, is that I actually think it's underrated compared to some of the other books in this series. I think it's done incredibly well. I like the way that the magic and the sort of the gods of Tristia are explored and explained throughout book 3. As always, I love the 3 main characters. So we are following Falcio, Brasti and Kest, who are 3 greatcoats. They are magistrates who are wandering Tristia, trying to enforce the king's law. Now, we are following them multiple years after the king has died, and they are sort of partially disbanded, or they are disbanded as a society, as a judicial body, but these three are continuing to go around trying to enforce the king's law and do what is right and protect the people of Tristia. And this series is just great if you love epic speeches, if you love doing the right thing, you love people with flamboyant and heroic sacrifices. This is the series for you. I absolutely adored Saint's Blood, and I think once you get past Traitor's Blade, the first book, this series just takes off. It's just absolutely incredible. I am looking forward to reading The Tales of the Greatcoats, which is a collection of short stories set in this world. I have got it. I'm going to be reading it soon, but I absolutely adored Saint's Blood. I think it was done incredibly well. And again, cannot recommend The Greatcoats to you highly enough. It is just done so incredibly well, and is a world and a set of characters. That friendship group is a set of characters that I just love. I just absolutely adore, and I wish we would get more of them, and I can't wait to get little snippets more of them in this short story collection. In at number 5, breaking the top 5, is my second and final sci-fi book on this list, and that is by Arkady Martin. It is a memory called Empire. This is part of the TX duology. It is followed by A Desolation Called Peace, which got released in 2021, and this is a series that I absolutely adore. Both these books were 5-star reads for me, and they were just really well done. In A Memory Called Empire, we're following a new ambassador from a small mining operation who is sent to the large imperial empire next to them as an ambassador. The previous ambassador has been killed or has died under unknown circumstances, and this new young ambassador with very little training is there trying to continue to work for the good of their mining base, as well as working out what actually happened to the previous ambassador, and gets caught up in a whole load of political wranglings. I really enjoy, again, the found family we get here. I think the world building is very interesting. I like the very different feel of their home-based culture to the imperial culture. I think that's done very well. And A Desolation Called Peace, book 2, continues to expand on that incredibly well as far as I'm concerned. I think Arkady Martin does a really solid job building that world out, giving us more to explore while continuing to give us those same characters that we love. I think the character relationships are a real strength in this book, as is the political intrigue. So if you like good character growth and relationships, but you also like a good healthy dose of political intrigue, this really could be a good sci-fi series for you, and it is probably my favourite sci-fi series at the moment. I can't think of a sci-fi series that I enjoyed more than this duology. Sci-fi isn't always my thing, but this was a great political intrigue heavy sci-fi series. Then we move on to number 4. Now, number 4 might sound strange to you that this book is only number 4 on my list, even though this is my favourite series of all time. And this is book 13 of the Wheel of Time, Towers of Midnight. This year, as we went into 2021, I had finished up to the end of book 11, Knife of Dreams, so I only finished off the last 3 books during 2021. My favourite of those, I think, is Towers of Midnight, although all 3, The Gathering Storm, Towers of Midnight and A Memory of Light, are all incredibly good. It's splitting hairs to tell you which one I prefer, to be honest, and actually Robert Jordan had intended them to be a single book, so yeah, it's hard to split hairs there, but I think Towers of Midnight does take it, but I really love the ending of The Wheel of Time. It is such a great build-up. We have had so many books of getting to know these characters, seeing them develop. It is a slow build of development, and I cannot tell you how much I think the payoff pretty much nailed it. Like, the payoff of this character development, this character growth, the relationships that are built, it's just paid off so well. Jordan had planned this out incredibly well. I think Sanderson does a good job getting it to land, taking those pieces of writing that Jordan's already done, trying to add in his own elements to make this work, to build this into a really strong finale. I know there are some things that I would love to have been a little bit different, but all in all, this was an incredible series with a really strong ending. And for me, Towers of Midnight encapsulate that the best. The reason for me that A Memory of Light doesn't get it is it felt a little one note. There was sort of one big thing going, and it took a lot of pages to get through that. Now, I think they did it really well. Don't get me wrong, I think the way they wrote that was very good, but I like the more variety we got in the books leading up to that. But all in all, this is a wonderful, wonderful series. I know it's a 14 book or a 15 book commitment if you want to read the prequel. So yeah, I know that's a big commitment for people, but I can highly, highly recommend Wheel of Time as one of the sort of cornerstones when fantasy started moving from what was Tolkien fantasy into a more developing style where more variance was allowed, people could do different things, and it definitely works from that base early on to a wonderful epic of its own proportions and its own right. And I just love this series so much. But Towers of Midnight is probably my favourite of these last three. We're now moving into some of my favourite books of all time. This year has been a great reading year for me, and we're into the top three. In at number 3 is a book that I read very early on in 2021. I read it in January, and that is Kings of the Wild by Nicholas Ames. Now this, if you don't know about it, it's a very fun sort of D&D-esque fantasy book. It is very comedic and humorous, but it still delivers interesting and good emotional beats later on. We are following Clay Cooper as he and his friend are trying to get their band back together. So in this world, the mercenary bands are like rock stars, and there's a lot of references to rock bands and 70s music. It's very well done, very funny. For me personally, I know for some people the humour may not land, so your mileage may vary, but I think it's a very well done book. And about halfway through this book, I was enjoying it. It was fun, it was a romp, it was a rollick, it was a great time, but I couldn't see how it was going to deliver much emotional impact. I thought it was just going to be a good, fun read. But the last quarter of this book does a very good job at really raising the stakes. We realise that we know the characters better than we probably think we did, and that we have a real connection, or I certainly felt a real connection to a lot of our characters, and it starts to deliver gut punches to you as you go through, as things go wrong, as things develop. And I really realised how much attachment I had to these characters that I thought were just fun and quirky, but actually I was developing an emotional relationship with. And I think that Nicholas Ames does that so incredibly well. I also gave 5 stars to the follow-up from this, which is Bloody Rose, which is book 2 from the band series. But all in all, this first book just really caught me unawares towards the end at how much I had actually engaged with it, how it had moved from what I thought was just a fun, funny romp to something that I actually was really engaging with and really enjoyed. I cannot recommend this highly enough to you. I think Bloody Rose is less comedic. It's a similar style, but less comedic, with more heavy emotional impact throughout. But Kings of the Wild for me was such a surprise that I just absolutely adored it. And it was my 3rd favourite book I read this year. Absolutely incredible. In at number 2 is one of the few releases from 2021 that has made it onto this list, because I read a lot of backlist books in 2021, and that is The Shadow of the Gods by John Gwynne. Now, I love John Gwynne. In 2020, I read the entire of his back catalogue that was out to date, and nearly all of those books I gave 5 stars. All of the Banished Land saga I absolutely adored. I think were incredibly and really well written. The Shadow of the Gods is the start of a new series. This is the first book of a new series, unrelated to the Banished Lands, unrelated to Faithful and Fallen, and it is a very Norse, Viking-inspired fantasy setting. And I love this setting. I think it is done incredibly well. I like the way that John Gwynne doesn't spoon feed us the elements of this world, but he lets us discover them naturally as they develop throughout the story. We are learning about the world as we go without getting any massive info dumps. We are following some absolutely wonderful, wonderful characters. Orca is an all-time favourite character already. I really like Varg as well. He's one of our other main characters. Elva, who's the 3rd main character we follow, I enjoy as well, but she definitely took a bit longer for me to engage with and to get to grips with and understand her motivations. But Orca and Varg, super cool characters straight from the off, and I love the way this book ended. I love the setup for future books to come. And The Hunger of the Gods, book 2, is coming out, I believe, in May this year. So I am super excited for that. And if you like really well-written battles, if you like fights that aren't just there to add conflict and to have fights, but to actually have real stakes in them throughout, so good from John Gwynne. Writes it really, really well. And I absolutely loved this book and cannot wait for the continuation of it. And then we're moving on to number one, my favourite book that I read in 2021. This is a series I love. This was a series that I absolutely adore. It was slightly easier to pick my favourite book from it compared to some of the others, but this series is The Long Price Quartet by Daniel Abraham. And the book I have chosen here is An Autumn War. That is book 3. Now, for those of you who don't know, The Long Price Quartet is a 4-book series. We are following along in the nation of the Cayenne. So these are cities of the Cayenne. They are sort of different nation states that are loosely banded together. And the reason that these work as a sort of a singular state or culture is that they all have access to the on dot. Now, on dot are like ideas made manifest. So they're ideas that are spoken into being as physical forms. So one of them that we meet early on is called Removing the Part That Continues, or Seedless is how he's referred to. And the idea here is that this on dot is able to remove seeds from plants, yeah? And this doesn't sound very exciting, but what it does is it gives the Cayenne a really strong economic advantage in the cotton trade, particularly in Saraket where he is based. They have a massive economic advantage in dealing with the cotton trade, as they can quickly and easily remove seeds from cotton plants and continue that process. And so the way the on dot works is that this is not, they're not a militaristic power that the cities of the Cayenne have, but they are much more an economic power. Now, in lots of ways, these on dot could be turned to be militaristic powers if they needed to be, but that is not their main aim. And actually what we get to explore throughout the Long Price Quartet is that so much of global politics is not just based on militaristic issues, but it is based on economic issues. And I think Daniel Abraham does an incredibly good job of exploring that. Book 1 is definitely slower paced and is definitely the weakest, but for me, from book 2 to book 4 are just banger after banger. For me, Autumn War book 3 is the best. I love the setup of it. We are introduced to new characters from different nations that I really love, and I think have very strong motivations, whether you agree or not. Love them or hate them, they have very clear and strong motivations and are understandable as far as I am concerned. And then Daniel Abraham does an amazing job at exploring ramifications of big world-changing events, and that's both through book 3 and book 4. I think the way that he explores what are world-shaking events is just incredible. I think so many of the characters are super understandable and relatable. You don't always like them, sometimes you hate them, sometimes you think they are crazy and just doing things that you despise and can't get on board with, but I understand them. But some of the character work here is unbelievable. Marty and Ota from book 1 are just astoundingly good characters, and we get to follow some of these characters through 70 years of their life. There's 14-year time jumps between these books, which as a statement sounds weird, and I'm sure lots of people that's kind of off-putting. It was a little bit for me, but as you read them, it works. It works so well. The characters have developed off screen, but in a way you would expect, in interesting ways. It's not like they've done a full 180. You still see their personality from before, even through the time jumps. But I just love the way that Daniel Abraham has done those. I think he's done them very, very well. And Ota and Marty are some of my favourite characters throughout the whole of fantasy. They are just done so well, as are so many of the other side characters as well. Just very, very well done. And for exploring huge world-changing events, I think Daniel Abraham conveys people's motivations and thoughts and feelings and emotions on those really, really incredibly well. It is tragic in many ways and beautiful in many ways, and just such a wonderful series. If you aren't looking for sword and sorcery, if you aren't looking for big, epic battle fantasy, but you want thoughtful political fantasy, you need to read The Long Price Quartet. It is absolutely astounding and one of my favourite series of all time. Autumn War, best book I read in 2021, with very little doubt about it, to be honest. It's just so good. I hope you guys have enjoyed hearing my top 10 books from 2021, and hopefully I'll see you guys again soon.